It was January of 1972 when a little TV movie made a big splash on network television. Taken from a novel that wasn't even published yet, this movie had the highest ratings for any television movie at the time. Before The X-Files, before paranormal investigators became pop culture icons, there was one reporter chasing vampires, werewolves, and things far stranger. He was a man in a wrinkled suit with a tape recorder and a story nobody else wanted to believe. And for one brief season in the 1970s, this man was the most compelling character on television. Let's get into it. Fantasy, sci-fi, horror, Rerun Zone. Kolchak the Night Stalker was different from other TV shows, and the monsters weren't what made it different. Television had seen its share of vampires and creatures before, but this one felt different. This one felt closer to home. Carl Kolchak wasn't a hero. He wasn't out to save the world. He was just trying to get the story. Working out of a cluttered newsroom, constantly clashing with his editor, and chasing leads that sounded more like rumors than facts. Kolchak always seemed one step behind whatever he was hunting, and one step ahead of everyone else who refused to believe in him. That was the real hook of the series. Every episode played out like a mystery that slowly unraveled until the truth became impossible to ignore, only to be dismissed again, just in time for the next case. But the story of Kolchak didn't begin with the series. It began with something bigger. 2 television movies that captured lightning in a bottle and changed the direction of network television almost overnight. Darren McGavin was Carl Kolchak. You can't imagine anyone else playing him. Once McGavin accepted the role, he didn't just play Kolchak, he became Carl Kolchak. He reshaped the character to his image. The hat, the seersucker suit, the slightly disheveled look. That all came from McGavin himself. And the 2 television movies, they didn't feel like television at all. They were an experience. The first movie, The Night Stalker, took viewers to Las Vegas, a city already built on illusion. That's when Kolchak begins investigating a string of brutal murders that don't quite add up. Victims completely drained of blood, and a suspect who doesn't seem to exist. What made it work wasn't just the idea of a vampire. It was the way Kolchak told the story. Through his tape recorder, through his notes, through that slightly sarcastic, world-weary narration that made everything feel just grounded enough to believe. And when the truth finally reveals itself, it doesn't feel like fantasy. It feels real. The film became a massive success. It was one of the highest-rated TV movies ever at the time, and suddenly, audiences wanted more of this rumpled reporter who kept stumbling into the impossible. So fast forward to a year later when they decided to bring him back in The Night Strangler. This time, the setting shifted to Seattle, with Kolchak investigating a series of murders tied to something even stranger. A killer who'd been operating for decades. Not quite immortal, but sustained through a process that made the story feel real. And once again, the formula worked. But before Kolchak was to become a weekly series, there was actually one more story waiting to be told. A third television movie. One that never got made. It was called The Night Killers and was based on a story by Richard Matheson and completed by science fiction writer William F. Nolan. This time, the setting would have shifted all the way to Honolulu, with Tony Vincenzo bringing Kolchak back into the fold, only to uncover a mysterious UFO and important people being murdered. Kolchak, of course, is the only one willing to connect the dots and come to a conclusion that sounds impossible. That something not of this world was already here and replacing people with androids. The Night Killers became a glimpse of where Kolchak might have gone if the story had been told just one case at a time. It feels a lot closer to what shows like The X-Files would eventually become. But that's when the network stepped in and decided that instead of leaving Kolchak as a rare event-style character, they wanted to turn him into a weekly series. What had worked so beautifully as an occasional story was about to be tested every single week. When the series finally arrived in 1974, the setting moved to Chicago. Kolchak was now working for the independent news service, constantly butting heads with his editor, Tony Vincenzo, a man who didn't want monsters, didn't want trouble, and definitely didn't want Kolchak turning every assignment into something that could get the paper shut down. That dynamic became the backbone of the show, because every week pretty much had the same premise. Kolchak hears about something strange. He starts digging. Nobody believes him. And by the time he finally uncovers the truth, it's too late for anyone else to see it. The evidence conveniently disappears. The story gets buried. And Kolchak is left right back where he started, with nothing except the knowledge that it all really happened. Here's where the cracks start at the show. What worked perfectly in 2 television movies began to feel a little too familiar when it had to happen every single week. The network wanted a monster of the week, and to be fair, the show delivered. You had vampires, werewolves, ancient killers, creatures pulled from myth, legend, and sometimes something a little harder to define. But underneath it all, it was still the same story structure, again and again. And the one person who understood that better than anyone was its star, Darren McGavin. He didn't just play Kolchak, he believed in what the character could be. He pushed for better scripts, more variety, stories that didn't always reset back to zero at the end. But the network wanted the episodes to stand alone. Nothing could really change. That meant Kolchak, no matter what he experienced, had to keep starting over. Even with those limitations, something about the show still worked. Maybe it was the atmosphere, those dimly lit streets and empty alleys. Or maybe it was just Kolchak himself, a man who kept chasing the truth even when the world kept telling him to stop. What made Kolchak special was that we could all identify with him. He was an everyman just looking for the truth in a world that wanted to hide its eyes. Every episode didn't have to be perfect. We just wanted to see Kolchak in action, chasing what no one else wanted to see. And in the end, even though no one else believed him, he came out victorious, and we loved it. When it came down to individual episodes, none really stood out as much as the original TV movies did. For one thing, neither writer Richard Matheson, known for his outstanding work on The Twilight Zone, or Night Stalker producer-director Dan Curtis were involved. To further complicate things, both ABC and Universal Television Studios never got permission from Kolchak creator Jeff Rice to go ahead with the weekly series. Rice sued the studio, and the conflict was resolved before the first episode aired, with Rice receiving an on-screen credit as series creator and retained firm control over the literary rights to Carl Kolchak. That allowed him to later authorize novels, short stories, and comics based on Kolchak. None of the episodes relied on big effects or elaborate production. What they had, though, was atmosphere, a sense that something wasn't quite right, even before Kolchak figured it out. And at the center of it all was a character who didn't have all the answers, but kept asking the questions anyway. By the end of the season, though, Darren McGavin was exhausted, not just from the workload, but from fighting the same battle over and over again, trying to keep the stories fresh, while the production kept falling back into the same formula. He later admitted that he simply didn't want to keep doing the same show every week. Despite all the issues behind the scenes, Kolchak the Night Stalker actually performed well in the ratings. It wasn't a failure, it just wasn't sustainable the way it was being made. By the end of the season, you start to realize something just a little bittersweet. That the show never quite solved its biggest problem, but it never lost what made it special either. And maybe that's why, even after just one season, people still remember the man in the hat, walking alone through the night, chasing stories nobody else would touch. In the end, Kolchak the Night Stalker didn't run for years. It didn't build a long, evolving storyline, and it never quite became what it might have been, what it could have been. But somehow, that never really mattered, because what it did do was create a character that felt real in a world that clearly wasn't. A reporter who didn't have special skills, didn't have backup, and didn't always win. But he kept showing up, night after night, case after case, writing things down that nobody wanted to print, and chasing truths that nobody wanted to hear. And maybe that's why the show never really disappeared. Years later, when Chris Carter created The X-Files, you could still see Kolchak's shadow in every investigation. That same idea, that the truth is out there, even if no one believes it. So when people look back at Kolchak the Night Stalker today, they don't just remember the monsters. They remember the man who went looking for them. A little underdressed, a little out of his depth, but always willing to ask one more question and follow one more lead, even when it meant walking straight into the dark. And sometimes, those are the stories that stay with us the longest. Not because they lasted, but because for a brief moment, they felt real. Kolchak never had an official sign-off line, just a tape recorder and a story that nobody wanted to hear. If you watched Kolchak the Night Stalker, share your thoughts in the comments below. What were your favorite episodes? And did you like the series, or did it not really connect with you? This is Riff from Rerun Zone. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.